everyone. Welcome to CIL's e-conference, Where is ASEAN in COVID-19? Today's session is scheduled to run for approximately 90 minutes, including a Q&A with questions from the floor. Please note that Professor Tommy Koh will now be delivering the closing remarks to this session today. At any time during the session, you're warmly welcome to pose questions to the panel using the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please allow me to now introduce our moderator for today, Ms. Denise Cheong. She's a senior research fellow with CIL and head of our nuclear law and policy team. Over to you, Denise.
To today's session on Where is ASEAN in COVID-19, the fifth in the Center for International Law's e-conference series on COVID-19, a challenge to the international legal order. Today, we want to bring discussions closer to home, focusing on ASEAN's response to the current pandemic. Like many parts of the world that have been affected by the pandemic, the Southeast Asian region is no exception. The region has recorded more than 70,000 confirmed cases and more than 2,000 deaths, far exceeding the numbers for SARS. Thailand was the first ASEAN member state to do so on 13 January, and by 24th March, in a span of less than 10 weeks, all ASEAN member states had reported cases. As the outbreak unfolded at the national level, on 15 February, Vietnam, as chair of ASEAN, issued its first statement on COVID-19. At this point, 6 ASEAN member states had reported cases, and the WHO had yet to declare the outbreak a pandemic. Vietnam emphasized in this statement the following. Firstly, the importance of ASEAN solidarity and the spirit of a cohesive and responsive ASEAN community, and this is in line with its chairmanship theme. Secondly, the importance of the WHO in the global campaign to control and contain the spread of COVID-19. And thirdly, the importance of an orchestrated response and collective actions of ASEAN in curbing the spread of the disease. Since then, to tackle the different dimensions of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen ASEAN convene many meetings, mostly virtually. On 14th April, ASEAN and ASEAN Plus 3 leaders held 2 virtual summits, the Special ASEAN Summit and the Special ASEAN Plus 3 Summit. These 2 events build on earlier intra-ASEAN meetings, as well as meetings with external partners at the ministerial and/or senior officials levels. Since the virtual summits, such intra-ASEAN meetings and meetings with external partners have continued. These meetings have cut across multiple sectors from foreign affairs, health, and the economic sectors to other sectors such as defense, agriculture, tourism, and most recently, the labor sector. It is against this backdrop, we are very privileged to have with us today 6 speakers to help us unpack ASEAN's response to the current pandemic. In the interest of time, let me briefly introduce them to you, but I will add that their full bios can be found on CIL's website. Our first speaker today is Professor Mely Caballero-Anthony. Mely is Professor of International Relations and head of the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Our second speaker, Associate Professor Simon Tay, is the chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, and he teaches international law at the National University of Singapore Faculty of Law. Our third speaker is a colleague from the Center for International Law who also teaches at the NUS Faculty of Law. Dr. Tan Hsien-Li is the co-director of teaching for the ASEAN Law and Policy Program at the Center and is also the general co-editor of the ASEAN Integration Through Law book series. Our fourth speaker is Ambassador Peng, Ambassador Koh is presently Singapore's permanent representative to ASEAN. Prior to her ambassadorial appointment, she served as Director General in the ASEAN Directorate at Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Our fifth speaker, Ambassador Tan Huong. Ambassador, I hope I pronounced that correctly. She's presently ambassador with the Embassy of Vietnam in Singapore. Prior to this, she was Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Vietnam, where she held various portfolios in the Department for Southeast Asia, South Asia, and South Pacific. Finally, providing the closing remarks today, we have Professor Tommy Koh, who is the chairman of the Center for International Law's Governing Board, and also Ambassador at Large at the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I'm done with the introductions, but before I turn to our first speaker, I would like to remind our audience that they're very welcome to ask questions through the Q&A function, and that these will be answered after all panelists have spoken. Mely, if I may, I will start with you. Given the experience of ASEAN in dealing with pandemics, we've experienced SARS, avian flu, swine flu. How would you assess ASEAN's response to COVID-19? And given the lessons learned, what are some of the areas that you think ASEAN can better address in dealing with COVID-19 and future pandemics? Mely, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Denise. And first, thank you to the Center for International Law for the kind invitation to join this panel today, which is talking about a very timely issue. Before I dive into assessing ASEAN's response and what we can do better, I just want to raise two very important points, I think, which is critical when we talk about how exactly has ASEAN performed. The first point is something that's not new, but I think it really bears reiterating, that although ASEAN has experienced pandemics before, as you mentioned, the current COVID-19 pandemic is really something else. It's been described as a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic of global proportions that has affected, I think almost all of humanity, and has to a large extent really caught a lot of countries and people by surprise. Second is when you talk about then responding to this huge, extraordinary pandemic, one has also to be mindful about the nature of ASEAN as an organization and the kind of capacities that it has to mount a regional response. So having said that, how do I think ASEAN has responded? I mean, considering all the things that I've mentioned, I think it's, not bad. I would say even relatively good, because if you look at 4 months into the crisis, you would see that the region has not had that kind of chaos and the kind of, the extent of how do you say, crisis that you see in parts of Europe, and you're seeing in America, and now even in Latin America. And that largely is due to the way the region over the past few years and decades since the SARS crisis has really put up an effort to prepare for these pandemics, right? So you have, over the years, really certain regional mechanisms, important mechanisms pertaining to the health sector that have played an important role in the 3 key areas of pandemic preparedness and response, which is the prevention, the detection, and the response to any case of infection. And if I could just mention 4 key important regional mechanisms that have been activated immediately. You have your ASEAN plus ASEAN Health Ministers meeting, but within, and your ASEAN plus 3 Health Ministers meeting, but within this groupings, you have the ASEAN Emergency Operations Center, which is really the focal point of ASEAN member states in dealing with public health emergencies. What does this center do is they provide critical information exchange on the nature of the pandemic, the protocols that you need, the technical guidelines that have to be followed. And this information exchange among officials is also supported by what you call now a virtual information platform that is, you call it the ASEAN Biodiaspora, a virtual center that produces also very critical risk assessment as to the nature of this pandemic, its spread, its potential for spread, whether it's being imported or exported. And this information is downscaled along, to the Southeast Asian region. And apart from these two information platforms, you also have, of course, your network of laboratories, which is very important when it comes to diagnostics, showing the readiness, identifying some of the gaps, and where technical assistance can actually be shared among member states. And you also have the epidemiological training network and your other network for information sharing and communication risk, which apart from disseminating information is also trying to prevent the spread of misinformation. Now, all of this information can easily be had in the ASEAN website, but I think what is important to note is that your health sector in ASEAN has been working, even before the crisis has actually blown out of proportion in keeping the region quite safe. So that's on the medical side. There's also the realization, of course, among ASEAN that this is not just a medical crisis, right? It is ballooned into a massive economic crisis with really serious consequences. And one of that is, the concern now about access to basic commodities, especially food. Hence, you have, as you have mentioned, Denise, a number of meetings and a range of statements that really identify critical agenda that the whole ASEAN member states have to work. And if I could cite three critical agenda, one is really the need to provide for resources to continue with this capacity building in the region to deal with this pandemic. So you have the ASEAN Resource Fund, also the idea that you must also think about the possibility of coming up with a regional stockpile of very critical medical equipment, particularly in anticipation of the possibility that, if in a certain country there's going to be escalation of the crisis, that you actually have either won't have the kind of crisis of lack of access to important medical items. Second is, of course, the need. I think somebody's, Professor Tay is going to talk about that, really keeping the supply chains open to trade and investments, because particularly for very important critical medical supplies, and working around the issue of eliminating barriers to critical medical equipment. I mean, that is very important in cases of medical, this kind of public health emergency that we're having. And the third is, making use of the current strength and expertise in the region to push ahead with, apart from just information exchange, really ensuring that you are able to work together in research and development of critical drugs, medicines, therapeutics, and even vaccines. I mean, there is already some member states have already been participating in, in the universal UN-led testing of vaccines, but downscaling this to the region is something that really would give the region some ownership as to the way they're dealing with this regional problem. Now, if I want to go back to the information exchange, there's some of us who might say that, it's just information exchange anyway, but this goes a long way, I think, in fostering a very critical, often intangible benefit of really fostering and building trust and confidence among the 10 ASEAN member states together, of course, with the 3 Northeast Asian states under the ASEAN +3, because you need to be able, this is a crisis, not just it's a regional crisis, but it is in their shared interest to ensure that everybody is working together. So getting information about what the other member states are doing, how you can help them, actually, you know, not only strengthens regional cooperation, but really builds that foundation in ensuring that you have, you are in one, right, in addressing this issue and moving forward, because this crisis is going to be with us for the long haul. So the ASEAN and all these meetings that you have talked about really underscores now the need for what they call in ASEAN parlance multi-sectoral response to a crisis. Because when you look at the nature or the how do you say, the people that are actually affected by the crisis, you know, you have separate communities that have special needs, right? One is, of course, what do you do with your migrant workers that are, you know, that are present in many of your ASEAN countries? There are issues of protection, right? What do you do with, for example, with some of your elderly population that needs also special protection? So that's one. What do you do with immigration flows? Are we going to have coordination in, you know, even down to having the right protocol, immigration protocol? So everybody is involved, and and the kind of meetings that you're actually undertaking at the moment is important in showing that ASEAN is actually responding to this crisis together.
Thanks very much, Mely. Thank you. Thank you for that very helpful framing of how we should be thinking about ASEAN's response. I couldn't agree with you more about your observations about the ASEAN +3 cooperation and just the great work that the health sector has been doing. They were early in the game, they were very active, and we see institutions like the ASEAN Emergency Operations Center Network, as well as the ASEAN Biodiaspora Center mechanisms doing really, really good work and really supporting in very tangible ways the work of the health sector. And I would just note that these are mechanisms that we didn't have in prior pandemics. So it's very helpful that in this pandemic, where, as you say, it's once in a lifetime, we have these tools to support the work that we're doing in ASEAN. If I could very quickly now turn to Simon. Simon, Mely's touched a little bit on the economic impact. When we think about the economic sector, it's always difficult because it's really a balancing act to manage the flows of goods and services on the one hand, and then the movement of people while still safeguarding public health. So, Simon, what is your assessment of ASEAN's efforts in the economy and in trade? The floor is yours, Simon.
Okay. Thank you very much, Denise, for letting me speak on this panel. I think I'm happy to pick up from where Mely has left off and focus on the economic. I've been allocated about 5 minutes, and I'll try to do my best to keep the time by keeping about maybe 5 points. The first, when we look at ASEAN, how it's done, I think the critical question is, what are we comparing it to? I think that ASEAN really, in some ways, quite a good job when we look at some of the other regional organizations. When Italy was struck, I think the EU really had to leave it alone. And while ASEAN has not been perfect, I think what Mely has said, and you've reinforced, is that there were some early statements, early efforts, and I think this will ramp up after the recent summit. My own view is that this is the first step, and there will be a continuing effort by the ASEAN leadership. The SIIA, which I chair, was very fortunate to be asked to put up a memorandum together with other think tanks for the summit, and then we'll be working a bit more about the ASEAN integration resilience. We'll also be looking at the chance of making the supply chains, which Mely mentioned, more resilient, not only for essentials, but for not just medical essentials, but other goods. So I think in this sense, the roles for ASEAN are to one, set a kind of baseline for what is happening. Secondly, to really set what I would say is a kind of effort to coordinate and frame the issues. And the third, of course, is to deal with the cross-border issues. So within that, my second point is that the ASEAN economic integration has really taken major steps forward. And I'm pleased to see that there's very limited backsliding. There may be some disruptions, but these are temporary because the first sense of urgency was very strong. But I think there is a commitment to keep the supply chains opening and functioning as best as possible. And this can be allied to effort to really deepen as the countries start to reopen. So economically, the processes, the structures that ASEAN have been put in place, I think have been helpful. They can go further, and in a way, making the silver lining is that we are actually in the midterm review of ASEAN's community plans, including economic integration. So this is a good time to look at what lessons the pandemic are teaching about resilience as a whole, about minimizing the trade barriers, the non-tariff measures, the things that really just obstacles to trade normally and get worse during an emergency. And additionally, I'd say on the second point about economic integration is that the economic will be hit. Now, if we're lucky, like Vietnam, will be relatively well compared to the rest of the world. But we are going to see a shift of growth trajectories. And it's only by sharpening and honing ASEAN's economic integration can we try to get those numbers up. In other words, if ASEAN economic integration made sense before the crisis, it makes even more sense during and coming out of the crisis. My third point is that there are within that some new points that have emerged that bear emphasis. I already mentioned supply chains and resilience. I think I want to emphasize that since Singapore is a major hub and has to play a major role in trying to help these supply chains keep going. I'd like to see ASEAN develop protocols about how to handle subsequent shocks, which may well come, tragically perhaps, as the infections may rebound. Second, the digital economy. Again, we were lucky ASEAN took initial steps forward during Singapore's championship 2 years ago. This continued under Thailand, and with the trends of technology and consumer habits, I think Vietnam and other championships coming up will be time to really reinforce this. Digital ASEAN is a relative greenfield and is ripe for planting in response to the disruptions we're facing with the pandemic. The third part, I think that simply, as Mely said, the trade of essential and medical supplies needs to be thought out. I think planning for pooling, just like we have rice pools, banks, I think this is critical. Each country needs to access a fair margin of what its national needs are, but not to panic so much when the second waves, etc., hit, and allow the free trade to flow. My fourth point is that as we look forward to the reopening, there will be a question of economic adjustments. Everyone's tried to put a lot of money into the plan. And I think that the overall financial scheme, and that's where the ASEAN +3 formula is not only a health framework, but a very important economic and finance framework. Don't forget the 1997 crisis, which triggered off a lot of the ASEAN +3 work. And in a way, the financial schemes will see a kind of revival of the need to make sure that the larger integration is there. I'd add, besides the ASEAN +3, the Australia and New Zealand. These countries are very close partners of ASEAN and have done well coming out of the crisis. They should find ways to include them more. Last but not least, I think that really ASEAN has come in for a lot of criticism. ASEAN cannot solve the problems of the individual countries. That's up to national governments. But in terms of providing that baseline, the effort to cross-border and trying to frame the issues correctly, I think ASEAN has made some of the initial right steps and look forward to more. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon. It's very reassuring for me to hear you say that in terms of the ASEAN integration and all the good work that's been achieved till now, that you don't really see that being very negatively impacted. So that's my first comment. And I also did want to pick up on something you briefly touched on ASEAN protocols. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, during his address at the Special ASEAN Summit, he mentioned the need for common criteria for trade and travel restrictions, a set of guidelines on when to impose travel or trade restrictions, and then where and how we can relax them and with what appropriate safeguards. And I think that this is a very valid issue that we need to discuss, because we're at a point where countries like Singapore, for example, were coming out of lockdown, and we have our other ASEAN neighbors who have gone ahead in this process. And yet I think at the back of all our minds is the concern that there might be a second wave, a third wave, and what should we do? So I wonder if you have comments. Just a quick reply to that, Simon.
I think clearly there is a need, and I think many countries see it. The flow of people among ASEAN is one of the thickest in the whole world. And I think the devil is in the details in terms of providing the common testing, the tracking mechanisms. We have different standards of tests, different quickness of testing. And I think the ideal tests that have both no false negatives and no false positives haven't really been found yet. I think Singapore government particularly has been quite conservative in preserving the swabbing test rather than the serological tests. And I think that the tracking systems, though, is something we can improve. A number of us have put in softwares that always can be better, but getting a version 1.0, which can track people across borders, I think one of the primary things we need to do before we start opening the borders again. So that's something I think that governments need to start working on in preparation for travel. I think business travel will go first. But of course, with countries like Thailand, tourism will be a very important sector to try to start.
Thanks very much, Simon. Hsien-Li, turning to you now, if I may. Hsien-Li, I think you will agree that given the interconnected world that we live in today, the need for global solidarity in our response to COVID-19 is evident. In the ASEAN context, when we look at the ASEAN emblem, we see the stalks of paddy or rice in the emblem that represents an ASEAN that's bound together in friendship and solidarity. So in your view, Hsien-Li, how has ASEAN solidarity helped the region tackle this pandemic?
Yeah. Thanks very much, Denise. So I think I want to continue the thread of what Mely and Simon have started on ASEAN and reflected this on the ASEAN citizen, on us, or the ordinary ASEAN people. But before I do that, I want to ask the more macro question regarding what is it we as ASEAN citizens or as ordinary people expect our international organizations and regional organizations, what do we expect them to do in times of crises or in times of pandemics such as COVID-19? Because if we look back in February and March when the coronavirus was picking up pace, we didn't know anything, and there were so many criticisms against the World Health Organization, against ASEAN, and then in Europe against EU, saying that they should do more, they should do more, they should do more. But what is it exactly we are asking our regional organizations or our international organizations to do? Because I want to go back to Simon's point, we cannot expect international organizations to take over the tasks of what a national state should do for its own people. What international organizations or regional organizations can do and should do is to facilitate the member states' capacity and capability to protect its people, to protect us. So on that point, I would like to go to the first issue. In all the ASEAN meetings that have been on the COVID-19 crisis, the special summit and all the other sectoral summits, the first thing on all these meetings agendas was information. So as Mely has said, we may say, bullet point number 1, it's just information. So what does it really matter? It matters a lot. To us as ordinary citizens, people, professionals, I think it matters so much in our own countries. And Denise, you have also said that, what we see now in ASEAN, we have never seen it before in other pandemic or epidemic crises that ASEAN has faced, be it SARS or avian or swine flu. We've never seen it before. Now, information is very important to ASEAN, and all our information meetings, networks, exchanges have brought all the member states up to speed on what are the impacts of COVID-19, what to us as ordinary people, what are the clinical symptoms, how do we protect ourselves, what is the hygiene protocol, how do we protect our loved ones, and then everyone now knows, not only the clinicians, but ordinary people, we know that we need to test, isolate, so on and so forth. I think all this information, if we really take a step back to think about it, did we actually as ordinary citizens know about such professional, medical, clinical type of information? No, this is real advancement for us in ASEAN, yeah? And I think because I come from a medical family, I think it's very important, and I have many friends who are doctors, and for them who are dealing with the crisis in Singapore, every new piece of new information is important to them. And my friends in other ASEAN member states, all this information is important to them on how they treat their patients, what sort of protocols they set in place so that they can treat, protect us people as better. So, and then the next thing I want to point out, apart from information, is that the second part on information that all the ASEAN ministers have discussed is how do we counter fake news. So fake news in the age of digitalization is very important, so on and so forth. But then we can see all around the world, and also, in our family networks, WhatsApp chats, there is fake news every day, right? And it's very important to counter such fake news. So to the ordinary citizen, I think the ASEAN ministers have got it right. And I think in our individual countries, ASEAN member states, the governments are disseminating the correct facts and truths about the coronavirus crisis. And I think one thing that the human rights proponents have brought up, and also the ASEAN governments have brought up, is that with real fact, we can counter discrimination. So I've read reports that COVID patients some COVID patients or healthcare workers are facing real discrimination, in every member state. And if real information gets to people and we educate them, I think such negative behavior can be countered. I mean, this is very uncivilized behavior, right? So countering fake news is an important part of the agenda. Now, turning to the economy, I think to the ordinary citizen, the economy is not only, what the economic ministers have talked about. So when it's a cross-sectoral approach, the tourism ministers have talked about it, the defense ministers have talked about how we can protect, our regional space for greater economic development, or and of course, our ministries of food and agriculture have been talking about food security, and all these flow back onto the ordinary ASEAN citizen. Of course, there is a lot more that we need to do, and the special summit has talked about this, but I think I want to stop here, and then we can discuss more during the Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Hsien-Li, for raising the theme of information and the importance of countering fake news. I just want to add very quickly to that in the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, in their press release, they made a similar point that one of the rights that we really need to safeguard is the right to access to information. But then they did go on to say very politely that there is still work for ASEAN to be done in this area to counter misinformation and fake news. And I note that this is also something that has been noted within the context of the 2 virtual summits. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you very much, Hsien-Li. Now, Just a quick update. Thank you to the audience for all the questions that have been coming in. I see a couple, I think 8, 9, 10 very good questions, and we still have 2 more speakers to cover, and I would encourage you to keep those questions coming in. Ambassador Koh, if I may. Since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Ambassador, ASEAN has taken steps, as we all know, and we've been discussing to coordinate its response. This has included coordination with its external partners. Through the various statements that have been put out by the meetings that I had mentioned in my opening, we see that priority has been given to the preservation of connectivity in the region, particularly on the supply of essential goods, as well as medical and food supplies. I think this was an issue that Simon and Mely, both of them, touched on. Ambassador, could you share more about ASEAN's response, your views of ASEAN's response to the pandemic in this particular regard, including the push to further strengthen multilateralism at a time when countries are being pressured to turn inwards? Ambassador, please.
Thank you, Denise, and thank you to SIIA for your invitation to take part on in today's panel. Your question requires at least 3 volumes to answer, so I'm going to distill my response thus. I note with interest the questions that are piling up, and they're pretty good, so keep them coming, please. Given our diverse audience and the slightly hidebound nature of regional organizations, please allow me to run through a few things that ASEAN is and a few that it is not. Since its inception, ASEAN has been a regional bulwark against external headwinds, political at first and economic later. This has meant constant evolution and adaptation. And we have also, over the course of our near 53-year history, developed a better sense of regional interests. And even as we retain sovereign autonomy, ASEAN member states see the benefits of working together for the common good. ASEAN is also an open and inclusive organization by design, where we are a highly strategic geopolitical and geoeconomic region. And recognizing early that we will not be completely free from major power attention, ASEAN is a conscious rejoinder that we will operate on our terms for our interests. But we are not an entity that shares or pools sovereignty. We are not a body insistent on regional consensus before national initiative. Indeed, our bilateral autonomy is every bit as valuable as our regional heft. Since 2007, when we adopted our ASEAN Charter, we have worked for regional integration and regional resilience. In 2015, we declared the establishment of the ASEAN Community with a capital C. The central tenets of our community building journey since have been the improvement of regional capacity in all sectors of cooperation, the delivery of a common suite of services to all ASEAN nationals, and the strengthening of links with our external partners for mutual benefit. These funnels of cooperation have become sturdy sinews for ASEAN's multifaceted response to COVID-19, underpinned by ASEAN member states' access to stable internet connections. Each ASEAN member state has faced different COVID-19 challenges and tailored our national strategies accordingly. But quickly we recognize some commonalities in the fight. The need for personal protective equipment, for medicines, for medical equipment, for food, for critical infrastructure. Hence, a regional strategy has been stitched together, sectoral by sectoral, culminating in the special ASEAN Leaders Summit on 14th April, and followed after by the ASEAN +3 Special Leaders Summit. We have actively engaged our partners, China, the EU, the US, the +3, and there is more to come. We have also been continuing the work of cleaning up the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or the RCEP, for signing this year, in line with our leaders' instructions. ASEAN believes that by maintaining links within our region and with our partners, we can remain a rear guard against protectionism and a counterpoint to suggestions that multilateralism and or globalization has failed. I think we have, well, clearly we have a ways yet to go in this pandemic, but I'm confident that ASEAN will get there. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ambassador, for that. I think, as you say, it's always very easy to criticize ASEAN, and very often people are quick to do so. And I think what's been really helpful in today's session is to hear our panelists really offer ideas and help us frame what it is that we should be expecting of regional and international organizations. So thank you very much for that. Ambassador Koh has also a question, I understand, for our audience. Ambassador, would you like to share your question?
Thank you, Denise. Yes, my question is, as ASEAN countries continue to tackle the COVID-19 outbreak, it is important to talk about how to facilitate a reopening of our economy and what our post-pandemic recovery plan may look like. I would like to hear views from the audience, or invite views from the audience, on the priority areas that you think ASEAN should focus on in the near to medium term of the recovery process. Thanks.
Thank you. For those responding to Ambassador Koch's question on priorities for ASEAN, and I do hope many of you will do so, please follow the instructions in the chat, the Zoom chat, as to how to go about providing your response. I think there's some instructions there for you. Now, turning very quickly to our final panelists for today. Ambassador Hng, thank you so much for your patience. I'll go straight to the question as we're running out of time. In setting its priorities for the 2020 Chairmanship of ASEAN, I'm guessing that until much later on, Vietnam probably didn't expect to be spending so much time coordinating a regional response to COVID-19. So with those remarks, would you please share with us your reflections on Vietnam's responsibility, what you see to be Vietnam's responsibility as 2020 ASEAN Chair, in terms of coping with the challenges and how it has strived to overcome some of the difficulties? Ambassador.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, SIIA, for organizing this very timely and meaningful e-conference. I would like to share with you some reflections on ASEAN Chair's responsibility in coping with challenges in 2020. Number one, as you may have known that AMM retreat in January have agreed to the whole year plan of 2020. But because of COVID-19, we had to postpone or cancel several summits and some other meetings at different levels. We had to make a lot of adjustments. We couldn't know for sure when the pandemic would end. So it was so much difficult to plan meetings and activities ahead. And how to stay connected and coordinated. Especially, it was so challenging to deal with matters that need direct and in-person interactions. Number two, The pandemic is unprecedented. It had many serious impacts on the health, lives, and safety of the people of ASEAN. It incurred severe human losses. So the challenge has been how to collaborate among ASEAN countries to early control the pandemic, to save lives and protect our people. Number 3, COVID-19 has struck heavily on trade, economic development, and social security of ASEAN members, such as supply chains disruption, job losses, negative growth, food insecurity, and many social problems. This emergency situation requires ASEAN's urgent cooperation to respond to the challenges. Coping with these difficulties, as chair of ASEAN, how have we strived to overcome? Number 1, we have acted early. This is important because if we have acted later, the consequences may have been worse. At the beginning, nobody could imagine the extent of disruption as a result of the pandemic. Some people even thought it was like a flu and was of the idea of herd immunity. But in ASEAN, since the early days of the outbreak, Vietnam as the chair, together with ASEAN countries, had acted quickly. And on February 14, we issued the ASEAN chair statement on ASEAN's joint response to COVID-19, which not only alerted of the dangerous risks of this virus, but also underlined ASEAN solidarity in joining action in preventing the spread of the virus and ensure safety of people. On 20 February, Chairman's press statement on COVID-19 highlighted ASEAN's commitment to maintain open economic policy and strengthen cooperation with ASEAN partners to fight COVID-19. Number 2, we acted coordinatedly. The ASEAN Defense Minister meeting on 19 February and the 26th ASEAN Economic Ministers Retreat in March also focused on strengthening practical cooperation among ASEAN in response to COVID-19. Since April, we, together with ASEAN members, organized e-conferences. On April 14, leaders of ASEAN and ASEAN Plus 3 held 2 separate virtual summits on COVID-19. One of the significant outcomes of the special summits were the proposed establishment of COVID-19 ASEAN Response Fund for public health emergencies. And it was followed by a lot of ministerial meetings on healthcare, economy, labor, tourism, and agriculture. This meeting focused on 3 directions. One is information and experience sharing. 2 is policy coordination. And 3 is action coordination. This solution has helped us stay connected and sustain smooth coordination and make quick emergency response. These actually help control the pandemic, protect people's life, and ensure food safety. This coordination is not only for urgent needs in the short term, but also for post-pandemic recovery plan and other goals in the longer run. Number 3, also very important, that's cooperation with ASEAN's partners. ASEAN organized or participated in meetings with its partners, such as China, the EU, the US, G20, and key international organizations such as the World Health Organizations to gather support and enhance the effectiveness of our response. So in the past 4 months, timely response and close coordination by the ASEAN chair and other ASEAN members have produced initial encouraging outcomes in our fight against COVID-19. I'm strongly confident that together, ASEAN will emerge even more resilient and even stronger from the pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ambassador. It's indeed, I think, immense pressure on leadership in general during these unprecedented times, and a great big challenge to be adaptable, resilient, and creative all at the same time. So thank you very much for sharing your reflections. As time is marching on, we're going to transition now to the Q&A session. Thank you very much to everyone in our audience who has sent through questions. We will do our best to answer as many of them as we can in the time that we have. And I start now with the first question from the Ambassador of Thailand. Thank you very much for your question. So I will read the question for the benefit of our panelists. Despite the diversity in the pandemic curve, situation and policies among the ASEAN member states, can ASEAN develop a common testing, tracking, and tracing protocol, or possibly vaccine development, which can help promote a shared path to a post-COVID-19 scenario marked by sustainable and resilient supply chains and safer connectivity? Simon, I'm wondering whether you might be able to help us with this question.
So-called C, Ambassador Surya, on the webinar. I would be chastened if I am too ambitious. Sometimes it's very difficult to really deal with joint development of vaccines, testing. ASEAN's diversity will play out in this. And one thing to forget that given the partnerships we have with other bigger countries, it could well be that the vaccine might be developed on an open platform, a global platform, or by other bigger countries. And the main task that would be to bring it into ASEAN and manufacture it enough so that it can be distributed widely. So in a way, I think we must right-size ASEAN's approach to this. But where I think it is very important and very good to ASEAN to move ahead is with the common testing and tracking that he's mentioned in his question. I think this makes sense because what I said earlier about the mass flows of people across the border, not just for tourism, but for everyday work. Migrant workers are a feature across every ASEAN country virtually. And if we can take a major step forward, we're not helping just the economic and macro sense, we're helping the real lives and livelihoods of some of the workers. And some of them are very, frankly, sort of the lower end of the economy. They really need help in this lockdown period. So I'm hoping that ASEAN can do it. But like I said, I think it's very difficult to do right across ASEAN. So where I think it will make sense and the easiest step forward will be kind of bilaterally. Your own country, Ambassador, has such massive flows of cross-border people with Cambodia, with Myanmar. If the border arrangements there can be done up, it may be a very good example. Singapore, Malaysia, and Johor especially, I hope this would be one of the very strong items on the agenda. And of course, supply chains can move and people can move by air, etc. And that will be another big challenge.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you. For our second question, thank you to Apichai Sunchinda for sending in your question. 2 days ago, an ICES paper written by Sharon Seah of its ASEAN Study Center called for quick operationalization of the ASEAN Coordination Center for Animal Health and Zoonosis, which was agreed upon in 2016. This could conceivably provide a good interlink between animal and human health nexus in the region's response to address emerging zoonotic diseases like COVID-19. Do the speakers have any comment on this? I open this to the floor. Does anyone have a comment on this ASEAN agreement? I would just add that, oh, I see Prof. Koh has raised his hand. Prof?
I think Sharon Xia, a former colleague at the center, has written a very important paper. Why? Because COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease. And there's an ASEAN agreement which, if ratified by Indonesia, will come into force. And we will then have a common platform for cooperation among ourselves and with relevant international organizations like WHO, FAO, the World Institute of Animal Health, to prevent future zoonotic diseases.
Thank you, Prof. And I note as well, there's been a statement, a ministerial statement from our ministers for agriculture. I think it was late April, but I don't believe that this agreement has been raised in that statement. So just something to add. Thank you, Prof. Moving to our next question. Nicholas, a question from Nicholas Calamita. Does the COVID-19 situation suggest that there is a need for further development of labor standards in ASEAN? Many of the hardest hit by the pandemic have been low-paid migrant workers living in reportedly dire conditions. In light of the pandemic, is there a role for ASEAN to address the rights and conditions of employment of these workers collectively, or should this continue to be addressed on a state-by-state basis? Panelists, is there anyone who would like to take this question? Simon?
If no one's going to, I think there's an important question that deserves an answer. But the questioner may not like my answer. I tend to be a bit of a realist in ASEAN. Given the diversity of economic patterns and the large populations, it will never be easy to set what is a decent standard at a pretty common standard across the region. What may seem to a Singaporean to be, wow, I can't live like this, is actually might be much better than what you see for migrant workers in border towns in some other parts of ASEAN, or even the settlements. They have very informal settlements on the edge of larger cities and capitals in ASEAN. I think this is where it's something ideally what we would like, but it doesn't seem possible. But where I think we can make a very important step forward right now is in the cross-border flows. When people are moving and when they land in a country undocumented or illegal in a sense, they're very vulnerable. And there is sometimes a way to, people who tend to point fingers at them. In Malaysia, sadly, there are some sciences happening with some of the Rakhine State Muslims. The undocumented workers have come to Malaysia as kind of their ideal choice because they are fellow Muslims, etc. And yet, there are some reports that people are singling them out, not because for testing, but simply to incarcerate them. And I think that's the vulnerability. The ASEAN think tanks and I have put together a very strong statement about addressing these vulnerabilities, but largely in this cross-border movement. In the end, when it comes to the living standards, the quotas, etc., like I said, I think there's just no comparable baseline that we can strike.
Thank you, Simon. I think that was.
I think.
Sorry.
I think Prof disagrees.
Okay, Prof.
Agree with Simon that ASEAN is extremely diverse. But I would respectfully point out that there's an ILO template on the treatment of migrant workers. And it must be the common aspiration of all ASEAN countries to be able to comply with those standards. I mean, that's the only point on it.
We have a related question from Akansha Kumar, who says, how far has been or can be the ASEAN Declaration on strengthening social protection used for the welfare of migrant workers? How far has been or can the declaration be used for the welfare of migrant workers across ASEAN member countries and borders? Anyone? Okay. No one has anything to add? Oh, Hsien-Li, did you? Sorry, Prof?
No, that's Hsien-Li.
Okay. Hsien-Li, the floor is yours.
Oh, I just wanted to add, you know, on the declarations on the protection of migrant workers and all the other, you know, instruments and the work that ASEAN has been doing. Yes, there's a lot of room for improvement, but maybe I should also put, you know, and I think we cannot forget that the sender states are also pushing for higher standards and greater protections for their nationals who go to, you know, the recipient states for work. So I think to answer both questions, the bilateral negotiations are very important. The declarations are important to show that ASEAN member states are thinking about these issues, but because they are declarations, there is no legal obligation for enforcement, but there is legal commitment. So commitment that if the ASEAN member states have signed up to this, they really should uphold the protections of the workers. And it's very testy, it's very sensitive, and there are so many issues involved, but I think, you know, countries are working towards it. Of course, there's going to be push and pull, but there are many advocacy groups that are also pushing for the betterment of standards. So, yeah.
Thanks, Hsien-Li. Just looking at the questions that continue to come in, there's one here from Tamsak. This is a question specifically for Ambassador Koh. What is the current status on the creation of the ASEAN Common Platform, which ASEAN leaders announced in their Bali Concord 3 in 2011, and which is scheduled to come about by the year 2022? Ambassador Koh.
Thank you, Denise, and thanks, Tamsak. Nice to see you in the chat. And thank you also to all the participants who have offered your ideas to my and views to my question. Tamsak, I'm going to give you a proper answer at a later date because I have to confess, you've asked me a pretty tough one. But I would like to chip in on the several questions asking about the possibility of common protocols to tackle the pandemic. To this, I would say there's work underway. At the Special ASEAN Summit, our leaders had already said we need these protocols. We need to look at, first and foremost, how to protect our people, in particular our healthcare workers. We also need to look at how to soften the impact of this pandemic on lives and livelihoods. That is the economic sector. We are also looking at how to help deeply affected areas such as tourism and aviation. Not everything can happen at once. Some needs are more immediate and urgent, but there is work underway to consider what we can do region-wide. And as to hold out some hope for people, I think that over the last 5 decades, we have done pretty well on this front, albeit not quickly. For example, all of the food that we eat has to meet a common standard of phytosanitary requirements. The eggs that we buy and sell to each other, for example, the rice that we buy and sell to each other, with each other, sorry. We have a common guidelines for various fields, and I think that there are challenges because we are 10 sovereign states, as I said in my presentation, which means that we have 10 not necessarily homogeneous national calculus to weigh. And we have to find a regional equilibrium. It's not easy, but it can be done. And I think given the gravity and the urgency of the pandemic, things are moving a lot faster than I've ever seen them move in ASEAN. So I just want to give you that little bit of hope there. Thank you.
Thank you. We probably have time for maybe one or two more questions. And there's a question here from Nisha. What is ASEAN's policy for disaster management? And how can we leverage off ASEAN's policy in a way that can benefit our healthcare sector? I think that seems to be the gist of the question. Mely, is this a question that you'd be able to help us with?
Yeah, thank you, Denise. We have already a policy. In fact, we have an agreement on disaster management and emergency response. It's a legal agreement in 2005. And because we have that agreement, we also have a very good mechanism now. We have established an ASEAN Humanitarian Center for the coordinating humanitarian assistance and disaster response, but this is for natural disasters, right? So I think the question is, do we have a mechanism that deals with, dealing with humanitarian disasters that's caused by pandemics, for example? So what's happening, in fact, is all the other mechanisms that have been put in place, whether it is in the delivery of disaster assistance, right, and the logistics that are in charge of it. We are now, there is now talk in ASEAN how the AHA Center, the center that coordinates humanitarian assistance, can actually help in, for example, the possibility of distribution of necessary medical goods to countries that are in need. And the ASEAN AHA Center has already been doing that. There's also a talk about how you can leverage on the existing ASEAN Center for Medical, from military medicine that can also perhaps help with the logistics, So because when there's a disaster, one of the important things that one has to remember is the steady supply of very important basic necessities, including, of course, medical goods. The other is the ability for rapid response. And that is something I think within the context of a health public emergency, I think it's not beyond one's imagination to think about perhaps also having an equivalent of the AHA Center for Pandemic Emergencies, because you do need rapid response, a medical team that will come in to assess, help in the assessment of the state of the crisis, what is actually needed, and to provide that much assistance. And this is where really the regional effort can be appreciated. As many of you have, as many of the panelists have mentioned, many of these problems that we have really requires a very good national response. In the absence of some expertise, then this is where ASEAN comes in. There was talk about, for example, what the food, we have a mechanism that deals with supplying rice in times of heightened emergencies. We have the APTER, ASEAN +3 emergency rice mechanism. You talk about protocols, there is a protocol. There are 3 mechanisms within the APTER that can actually be used, right? And that is also to ensure that, this is all related to the discussion about opening supply chains, right? There's a tendency for countries in the region to be worried about their national supply, so there's export control. But if you have, for example, a stockpile, and there is in fact this rice stockpile, it may be a virtual in the way it's organized, but as and when these are needed, they could actually be repurposed. So if you have already established policy on disaster management for natural types of disaster, then it's a logical it's a logical development, perhaps to really seriously consider something like an ASEAN CDC, since there's already a lot of work that's and ground that has been covered by your health officials. I just very quick point. This is not the first time that we have this level of information exchange actually when it comes to disasters, and that is why there's a comfort level of preparedness, because starting from, as a result of the 2003 SARS pandemic, especially also after the H1N1, all these mechanisms have evolved slowly, right? So information exchange, even down to the idea of protocols. How do you protect somebody, an ASEAN national who is infected, who crosses your border? Do you provide protection? And I believe there's already some discussion on that, and there's an existing protocol that helps, providing treatment for people that are actually in your, that have crossed that border. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Mely, Simon, just very quickly.
Step back and look forward for about 1 minute. I think what I've learned a lot from the convention around is that ASEAN's been doing a lot of work over the years and in the background. This may not make the national newspapers or the international media, and there's been a fair amount of criticism, frankly, at ASEAN. I think when we look at some of the things he's been doing, the details, it's really very much the credit of ASEAN, this hard work is going on. And I think that why I said earlier about realism and diversity has to be measured in that sense. This hard work is not that ASEAN's irrelevant, it's that we actually need more of ASEAN, more cross-border coordination, more regional infrastructure, centers, etc., to really do that hard continuing work. And it doesn't mean that ASEAN is in any way irrelevant. In fact, I think it means that ASEAN must move forward in the crisis.
Thanks very much, Simon. Before I invite Prof. Koh to provide us with his closing reflections, Ambassador Koh, I'm just wondering if you would like a quick minute or two just to summarize the responses you've gotten to your question.
Okay, Denise. But a quick word, I was remiss in not informing your audience that ASEAN has something called the ASEAN Coordinating Council, ACC. It is a charter body. It is ministerial level. And as the coordinating part of ACC suggests, the council looks at issues that don't sit neatly within the political security, the economic, or the social cultural pillars. And something like the pandemic definitely fits the bill. So the ACC has set up an official level body to deal with public health emergencies. And a lot of the ongoing work to set up regional guidelines, protocols, what have you, to deal with the pandemic are happening in conjunction under the purview of the ACC, and the ACCWG is helping to move things along. As to the responses I've been getting, two things jump out at me. One is ASEAN needs to have a strong R&D capability. We need to know how to do rapid testing and have in place common standards for testing. And we need to work on a vaccine really fast. I think these go without saying. I mean, they are hogging the headlines. But I just want to address one point which I think underpins the three common themes, which is that there's a concern that our region is being squeezed. We are part of global supply chains, but we are not the proponents, and we're not at the end. We're not the markets. We're in between. What happens to us if the threatened decoupling actually takes place? Where is ASEAN in all this? I think that ASEAN is going to double down on our economic integration. We were planning to do this anyway under the Vietnam chairmanship. And I think that this just hastens our work. Secondly, as I earlier mentioned, we have made progress over the years because we are open, we are inclusive, we believe in trade with anyone who wants to trade with us. That more than ever is very important today. And I think that ASEAN stands for free trade, stands for globalization, stands for integration. So I think in that sense, yes, we will need to work on test kits, testing protocols, etc. But underlying this all, this is because we want our region to remain open and attractive to our partners. Thank you.
Thank you. Prof. Koh, may I invite you now to provide us with your closing remarks?
Thank you very much, Denise. I would like to sum up the discussion in the form of a report card on ASEAN's response to COVID-19. And I will do it by asking 5 questions. First, was ASEAN prepared for the pandemic? My answer is that after the SARS epidemic in 2003 and other health emergencies, ASEAN has set up a number of cooperative mechanisms. Let me mention 5. We have a network for public health emergency led by Malaysia. Second, we have a biodiaspora regional virtual center led by Philippines. Third, we have a regional public laboratory network led by Thailand. Fourth, we have an ASEAN Risk Assessment and Risk Communication Center. Fifth, the rice stockpile co-organized with China, Japan, and South Korea is an important asset. So given that ASEAN has these 5 assets in place, I think I would not be wrong in saying that ASEAN was not unprepared to face this pandemic. My second question, did ASEAN respond promptly and effectively to COVID-19? I would say that ASEAN did quite well. Our health ministers, for example, met on the 30th of January 2020, and this was followed by a number of sectorial ministerial meetings of ministers of defense, economy, agriculture and forestry, foreign affairs, tourism, and labor. The most important meeting was, of course, the summit on 14 April. So my question then is, what are the important outcomes of these ASEAN meetings? I would say 4. First, ASEAN will not turn inward and become protectionist. Instead, ASEAN will remain open and will continue to support a rule-based international trading system. Second, ASEAN will keep its markets open. It will facilitate, not hinder, the flow of food and essential goods, including medical supply. Third, ASEAN will maintain its own productive capacity and will seek to minimize any disruption to the region's supply chains. And finally, ASEAN will exchange timely information and best practices and will cooperate to fight the virus. My third question, did ASEAN try to coordinate its efforts with those of its dialogue partners? And my answer is yes. ASEAN was proactive in seeking to coordinate its efforts with those of its dialogue partners. The most important initiative was, of course, the special summit between ASEAN and China, Japan, and South Korea on the 14th of April. But ASEAN ministers also met with their counterparts from the European Union and from Japan. One very important point. Relations between China and the United States have become increasingly toxic and hostile. ASEAN has managed to keep its balance between these two rival powers. ASEAN had a physical meeting with the Chinese Foreign Minister on the 20th of February and a virtual meeting with the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on the 23rd of April. ASEAN policy is to be on equally good terms with these two rival partners and not to take side in their quarrels. Question number 4. Was the doctrine of ASEAN solidarity reflected in the actual behavior of ASEAN countries? Solidarity and cooperation are two very important values of the ASEAN family. And I'm happy to say that I have found many examples of ASEAN countries helping other ASEAN countries. For example, Brunei and Vietnam have donated test kits to other ASEAN countries. Vietnam had donated PPEs to Laos. Singapore had donated test kits as well as ventilators and PCR machines to many ASEAN countries. Singapore had looked after the Malaysian workers stranded in Singapore, and in return, Malaysia has helped Singapore to repatriate Singaporeans stranded in other countries such as Egypt. My fifth question, what is ASEAN's attitude towards the World Health Organization, WHO? And my answer is, ASEAN has a favorable attitude towards the WHO. All 10 countries are members of WHO, but in a very illogical way, WHO has put 3 ASEAN countries, namely Indonesia, Thailand, Myanmar, in the Southeast Asian region, and the remaining 7 in the Western Pacific region. This is wrong, and I will appeal to WHO to put all 10 ASEAN countries in the Southeast Asian region. It is very important to note that ASEAN invited the Director General of WHO, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, to participate in the ASEAN +3 summit on 14 April. This is a vote of confidence in him and in the WHO. In conclusion, I would say that ASEAN, led ably by Vietnam, has responded quite well to the COVID pandemic. I want to make one additional point before I conclude. And this goes back to a point made earlier by Peng. ASEAN is an intergovernmental organization. It is not a supranational institution. The response of the region to COVID-19 depends less on ASEAN than on the member states themselves. And the response of the member states has been uneven, given the great disparity among them. Some member states, like Singapore, have world-class healthcare institutions. Other countries do not. Some countries like Vietnam responded promptly and decisively to COVID-19. Other countries did not. Some countries have the financial means to procure masks, test kits, PPE, ventilators. Other ASEAN countries did not. For an excellent review of the 10 ASEAN countries and how they responded to COVID-19, I asked members of the audience to read a very good article by Mr. Choi Shin Kwok, the director of RSIS, which was published in the Straits Times on the 9th of May this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Koh. That sounds like overall a very impressive scorecard with many yeses. A big thank you. The 90 minutes have gone by very quickly, and a big thank you to all our panelists for the very illuminating discussion we've had today. I for one, have certainly learned a lot. To our audience, we've tried hard to answer as many questions as we could. Sorry to those of you we were not able to, we haven't been able to answer your questions, but thank you all for enriching today's discussion with your questions. I very much hope you enjoyed today's session, and thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
A warm thank you to all of our speakers and panelists and Professor Tommy Koh. Thank you to all of our audience for joining us this afternoon. Please note that if you've enjoyed this series of e-conferences, the previous 4 sessions are available as video recordings on the CIL website, and that this is not the last that we will be doing on responses internationally and in international law to the pandemic. Please look out for our next 2 sessions on 28th May on the impact on international shipping, and on 3rd June on the impact on international aviation. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.